Welcome to Chapter 5 in our Beyond Feelings book. This is our critical thinking book. And in this chapter, we're going to talk all about opinions. We all have opinions. Not all of them are equal in quality, right? So we can have opinions that are informed or uninformed, based on evidence or not. And so we're going to use this chapter to kind of figure out how to assess the validity of our opinions and also kind of get an understanding as to why we get so attached to our opinions and why we're so adamant about defending them and how all of that relates to our ego. So one of the things that I hear people say a lot is everyone has a right to their opinion. And I think what's interesting about that phrase is it's often like a conversation stopper, right? Someone can just say, well, hey, I have a right to my opinion. And it's almost as if you're not supposed to debate their opinion with them. But of course, we can debate people's opinions, right? Especially the more informed those opinions are and the more based on evidence those opinions are, the more fodder we have for an actual quality debate. However, we do live in a free country and we can say whatever we want, but we have to be mindful of the fact that expressing our opinion has consequences. If we say an opinion that's uninformed or uneducated or not based on evidence, it could make us appear as weak-minded or not very smart and not very intelligent in certain situations. And of course, we can say our opinion, but sometimes we can be destructive towards relationships or other obligations that we have in doing so. For example, I can't just walk up to my boss and say, hey, I don't like your face. I have a right to my opinion, and that's cool. It's not cool. So our opinions can have consequences in a variety of different ways. So it's important to kind of evaluate the quality of our opinions, how we form them, their relationship with our ego. So that's what we're going to be doing in this chapter. Let's start by delineating between different types of opinion. There's really two broad types. There are expressions of taste and expressions of judgment as opinions. So expressions of taste are just your personal preference, your likes and dislikes. For example, an expression of taste that I have is that Brussels sprouts are delicious. You might think that they aren't delicious, but this is just an expression of taste, and we're both are allowed to say what we prefer and not prefer. But for our purposes as critical thinkers, there's really no point to debate that. So if I say I think Brussels sprouts are the best vegetable and you say there aren't, there's not really a basis for debate there because it's just our preference. And then the next type of opinion is an expression of judgment, and this one comes from inquiry and deliberation. For example, in a court case, when they say the court has delivered an opinion in this case, the implication there is that the court has had ample time to review the evidence and think about it and analyze it and then come up with a decision based on that analysis. So in this class, in critical thinking, these are the types of opinions that we're interested in, expressions of judgment. Those ones we can debate because there's actual tangible stuff there that we can kind of weed through and analyze and interpret and think critically about. So it can be difficult, though, to tell the difference between taste and judgment. If you look at the slide here, you see a picture of Casey Anthony. I don't know if you're familiar or not, but she was a notorious court case accused of murdering her daughter. So when you look at this picture, you see two phrases, one that says, I hate Casey Anthony, and one that says, the court finds Casey Anthony not guilty. So if I were to ask you which one is a expression of taste, it would obviously be, I hate Casey Anthony. This one's a little bit easier to delineate between. If you look at the Lady Gaga one, it's a little more complicated. Lady Gaga is the greatest musician of all time versus I love Lady Gaga. Well, I love Lady Gaga would be an expression of taste. Saying Lady Gaga is the greatest musician of all time can imply that this is based off of some gathering of evidence or some logic or some information there that we could actually look to and kind of debate. Maybe they're basing this greatest musician title off of record sales or quality of voice or performance ability. We don't know, but we would have something there to actually talk about. So Lady Gaga is the greatest musician of all time would then be an expression of judgment. So it's important to keep in mind that, of course, opinions can be mistaken, they can be incorrect, And your book has this quote in it, which I think really sums it up nicely. It says that a fundamental principle in critical thinking is that ideas are rarely equal in quality, solutions vary from practical to impractical, beliefs from well-founded to ill-founded, arguments from logical to illogical, and here we go, opinions vary from informed to uninformed. So just because we are free to have our opinions doesn't make them correct, right? Like, we are entitled to our opinions, but that doesn't mean that our opinion is accurate or true. Because just like our memories, truth, identity can be influenced, so can our opinions, even subconsciously by subtle things like color. Taster's Choice did a study where they put the same coffee in 3 containers and then just changed the color of the labels on each container. And then they had some participants come in and participate in an experiment where they gave them each a cup of coffee from each one of the containers, and the participants could see, okay, now I'm getting some coffee made from the coffee that came from the brown container. Now I'm getting some coffee made from the coffee that came from the yellow. And now I'm getting some coffee made from the coffee container that came from the red marking or the red packaging. So when they were given this coffee, they were asked which one tastes the strongest, the weakest, and the best, right? The perfect one. And so actually the people in the experiment said that the brown label was too strong, the yellow label was too weak, and the red label was just right. It was delicious. But it was the same coffee in all of the containers. It's just that those colors have a way of affecting our opinion of something, right? Our interpretation, our perception of something. So even things as subtle and as unassuming as the color of packaging can affect our opinions. Also, the way that information is what we call in psychology framed, the way it's presented to us, can affect how we feel about that, how we perceive that information, and affect our decision making because of it. So, for example, there was a study done where participants were told if you had cancer and you had to choose between surgery and radiation, I'm going to ask you which one you would choose, but before you tell me which one you would choose, let me give you some information. So out of 100 people that had surgery, 90 people lived through it, 68 people are alive 1 year later, and 34 people are alive 5 years later. With radiation, all 100 people lived through it, 77 people are alive 1 year later, and 22 people are alive 5 years later. So when given this information, then the participants were asked, okay, so now that you know this information, which one would you go with? And the people said surgery. And when asked why did you choose surgery, almost all the participants said because it says that 34 people are alive 5 years later. So then they changed the wording of the information with a different group of people and got different results. So let's look at that. So then they had these different participants and the same thing. Okay, so if you had cancer, would you choose surgery or radiation? Before you decide, let me give you some information. Out of 100 people that had surgery, 10 people died during it, 30 people died 1 year later, and 66 people died 5 years later. With radiation, no one died during it. 23 people died 1 year later, and 78 people died 5 years later. When the information was framed this way or presented to the participants in this manner, they overwhelmingly chose radiation. And when asked, why did you pick radiation, they said, because no one dies during it. It's the exact same information as the previous group. It's just that we changed the wording from focusing on who lives to focusing on who dies, and that changes people's perception and people's choice. So opinions are very, very easily influenced and obviously can be incorrect. So the idea that we are entitled to our opinion is really strong when it comes to discussing moral issues. So when it comes to a situation and someone asks us like, hey, what's the right thing to do in this situation, or what's the wrong thing to do, we feel a real sense of entitlement to our responses, and we feel a real urgency to defend our position. And I think it's because we kind of look at our opinions on moral issues as an extension of our own morality and a projection of our own goodness, or if we're good or bad people. is kind of laid out there for other people to see based on our moral opinions, is I think what we perceive. And this is because moral issues are considered to be really personal and very subjective, and that's kind of accepted. We have the idea that like your view is right for you and mine is right for me, and like don't step on my toes. If I think that abortion is wrong or you think it's right, then morally, then like we need to kind of respect each other's boundaries and be tolerant. And that's true to a certain extent, but would we say that a child molester is entitled to their opinion about how they should interact with children and what's morally acceptable? Like, no, we wouldn't, right? So not everybody in our society is on the same playing field intellectually, cognitively, in terms of mental health. So because of that, we have to have laws that kind of say, like, this is okay to do, this is not okay to do. And those laws are products of moral judgments. They are people's opinions about right and wrong. And as we've been saying in this chapter, our opinions are not perfect. They can be mistaken. They can be influenced. And so even the people that create these laws are fallible, and they are subject to the same limitations and imperfections as you and I, and their moral judgments may be correct or incorrect. So the best way to increase the likelihood that our moral judgments will be correct is to follow the following criteria. First of all, is the moral issue that we're talking about is it an obligation. An obligation is a restriction on our behavior, something we have to do or cannot do. For example, obligations would include contracts, relationships, employment, marriage. And so if we have two obligations that are conflicting, then we need to go with the one that's most important to us. So, for example, let's say you have this moral issue of you're falling in love with your employee, you're the boss, and you're falling in love with your employee, but your job bans fraternizing. So, do you choose love or do you choose the job, right? You have this relationship with this person, so you kind of have an obligation to them, but you also have signed up for this job, which you said you wouldn't engage in like inter-office relationships. So which do you choose? And the answer is whichever one's more important to you. If the job's more important, then you choose that. If the relationship's more important, then you choose that. And then when it comes to ideals, which are notions of excellence, goals that make us feel more harmonious with ourselves and others, things like honesty, integrity, fairness, and justice. When ideals conflict, again, you want to go with the one that's the most important to you. So there's this issue with medical marijuana in that it is very effective in treating people with epilepsy and greatly reducing their seizures. So there's been a bunch of cases like this, but one just for example was this mother who lives in a state where medical marijuana was not legal, and her child, who was I think 9, was suffering from epilepsy and having these really bad seizures, couldn't even go to school because of them, having like one an hour, just destroying the kid's quality of life. And the mom tried all the pharmaceutical medicines and all the treatments the doctors recommended, and nothing was working. And so she then heard about this form of medicinal marijuana that's non-psychoactive, and it comes in droplets. So she could give it to her child. The child doesn't get high. They're not smoking anything. But when she did that, it actually greatly reduced the seizures, like a lot. And the kid's quality of life totally improved, able to go back to school, all of that. So then here's this mom that has a law that says like you can't give your kid this drug that works. But then she also is a mom and sees that there's this drug that works after she's tried everything else. So she's really stuck between these two ideals, the ideal of being an honest person. And when asked by law enforcement, like, hey, are you giving your kid medical marijuana? She would like to be able to say yes, but she can't do that because that's not really fair to her kid. And that if she says, like, yeah, officer, I am giving my kid medical marijuana, then she's going to get arrested. She could lose her kid, which has happened in other cases, and the child's going to go back to having a ton of seizures, which has also happened in other cases. And that's not really fair to the kid, who could have like a way better quality of life if the law would just recognize this plant as a medicine. So this is an example of when two ideals conflict. In this case, It was between being honest and what's fair. And so a lot of parents choose what's fair and suffer the consequences for that, unfortunately. And then the third thing to consider when looking at our opinions on moral issues is consequences. So, consequences can be beneficial or harmful results of an action that affect the person responsible for the action and for other people. So, generally, when we think of a consequence, we kind of have a negative connotation associated with that. Like, okay, a consequence is always going to be something negative. But consequences can be beneficial too, right? If I buy a lottery ticket and then I win the lottery, the consequence of buying that lottery ticket was pretty good. It was pretty beneficial. So they're not always bad, but they come in many forms. Consequences for our decisions and actions can have a effect on us personally. They can have an effect on society. They can have an effect on us physically, emotionally. The consequences can be immediate or eventual, intended or unintended, obvious consequences, subtle consequences, possible consequences, probable and certain. So, actions that result in beneficial consequences or achieve the greater good should really be the actions that we go with when it comes to making decisions about moral issues. For example, let's say you have been in a relationship for a long time with someone and you feel as though they're not treating you very well, but you love them and you want to stay with them, but you're also not getting certain needs met. So then the question is like, do I cheat on this person and get my emotional needs met since they're not being met in this relationship? Or should I cheat on this person and get my physical needs met since my physical needs aren't being met in this relationship? And then what you would do is go through and kind of look at all the consequences of cheating on your partner and see if the consequences are overwhelmingly beneficial to you and to the other person and to your relationship as a whole, or if they're more harmful. And generally, in that situation, they would be more harmful, obviously. All right, for lecture activity 1, I want you to go to the link on the slide here and read over some of the moral dilemmas there and then choose one and tell me what you believe the correct moral decision would be for that given situation and why you think that is the case. What I really want you to do is feel yourself kind of getting defensive of your opinion and the passion that you feel in your correctness and the relationship that is to your ego. Really feel your ego get puffed up about these moral decisions and these moral opinions. I know every time I go through these in a class with students, I feel my own ego swell up and I feel very adamant that my opinion is the morally correct one. So allow yourself to kind of experience that. But at any rate, for the assignment, lecture activity 1 for chapter 5 and 6, you're just going to tell me which one you would, you're going to tell me which one you chose, and then what you believe the right moral decision is and why. All right, so one of the ways that we can detach our ego from our opinions so that we can be better critical thinkers, be more objective, be more open-minded, is to consider the idea that even experts are wrong in their expert opinions, right? There's so many examples of this in history of people who have spent their entire life studying one thing, or really genius people who have got an opinion wrong about something. And so the idea is, like, if these people can get their expert opinions wrong, then certainly we can get our opinions wrong from time to time. So some examples of expert opinions that were wrong include trephination, which in ancient times, this was the medical opinion that mental illness was caused by demons in the skull. So what you would do is, if one of the people in your village was acting abnormally, you would take them to the village doctor, and the village doctor would take tools. These tools are actually pretty sophisticated. There are some more primitive tools, like rocks and glass and other shaved objects that were used to trephinate people. But at any rate, you take the person who was acting abnormally to the village doctor, and they would drill a hole in the person's skull. The idea was that the person was acting abnormal because there was a demon in their head. So you would drill a hole in the head, and then the demon would escape, and then they would put like this metal piece back to cover up the hole and that would prevent the demons from getting back in, was the idea. And this was done for centuries, for like a very long time. So let's watch a quick clip on trephination. It's pretty gory, but it's TV, it's like fake blood, it's ketchup and stuff, so don't worry about it. But anyways, here it is, trephination.
Who is this man?
Run, get a doctor.
I don't want people dying in my house.
Do as I say, woman.
All right, so more incorrect expert opinions include the idea that inoculating people against disease, so vaccinations, was thought of as nonsense by Ben Franklin and the founders of Harvard Medical School. In 1890, Nobel Prize winner Koch said he had the cure for tuberculosis, but it actually made some people sicker and some people died. And then in 1904, psychologist Stanley Hall said that when women think too hard, they lose mammary functions, interest in motherhood, and have a decrease in fertility. In 1919 and 1922, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City bought 17 gold vessels from a 3,500-year-old Egyptian tomb, and in 1982 they realized that those were totally fake and they got scammed. In 1928, a medicine called thorotrast was created, and it was used to outline organs so that clear x-rays could be taken. But 19 years later, researchers found out that even the smallest doses of thorotrast cause cancer. And in 1959, a sedative called thalidomide was given to pregnant women to decrease the likelihood of miscarriage, and actually a large number of babies came out severely deformed because of it. So obviously there will be expert opinions that are overturned from our time, and they may even be ones that seem like definite facts. So it's important to keep this in mind when we really are clinging to our opinions and getting really like close-minded about looking at other opinions that might be contradictory. So when opinions are incorrect, they're generally incorrect or inaccurate because of one of these four broad kinds of errors. So errors that are common among all people by virtue of their being human, so the tendency to perceive selectively or rush to judgment or oversimplify complex realities is one of the reasons that opinions are incorrect or inaccurate. So for example, just take a look at the slide and then try to read it relatively quickly by saying the color of the font the word is written in. So don't read the word, just say the color of the font that the word is written in. So go ahead and pause the video and then give that a shot and pay attention to how many errors, you don't have to write it down or anything, but just how difficult it is or how many errors you make. Okay, go ahead and pause. All right, so if you got these wrong or even got them right but felt that how difficult it can be, this is because of this error that we're talking about, the tendency to perceive selectively or rush to judgment or to oversimplify complex realities. So here, your brain is rushing to judgment, right? It reads, it's a habit of mind, it just kind of goes in autopilot and does it, and this makes it difficult for you to focus on the color of the font versus the word. So the next error is errors with one's individual habits of mind or personal attitudes, beliefs, or theories. So the habit of thinking that the worst members of a group due to prejudice is an example of this, right? We have kind of these habits of mind, these attitudes, beliefs, theories that we hold, and prejudices and stereotypes are under the umbrella of those personal attitudes, beliefs, or theories that we might hold as an example. And I think that a lot of prejudice and racism, sexism, ageism, all of those things are often almost unconscious for some people. Some people aren't even aware of their habits of thinking when it comes to discriminatory ideas and thoughts, because they can be so deeply ingrained in our society and in our culture that we might not even be aware of them. So what I would like for you to do is look at this list and think about what stereotypes you've heard for these groups. Not stereotypes that you hold, not your own stereotypes. I'm not asking you to list those, but stereotypes that you've heard other people say. So, for example, when it comes to Caucasians, I've heard that they can't dance. African Americans, that they like fried chicken. Asians, that they're good at math. Women, that they're overly emotional. Muslims, that they're terrorists. Homosexuals, that they're promiscuous. Right? So those aren't stereotypes that I personally hold. That's just what I've heard other people say. And then, looking at my response to the chart here, most of those stereotypes are negative, right? So if my opinions are kind of leaning towards negative thinking of entire groups of people, that's obviously going to create a lot of errors in my opinions. Okay, so for lecture activity 2, I do want you to fill out that chart and tell me the stereotypes that you've heard people say for each one of those groups. And then you don't have to write anything down for this, but just look at it and reflect on, are most of these negative about people, or most of them positive about people? So just go ahead and write down the stereotypes that you've heard for each one of these groups. So the third error that can cause our opinions to be incorrect or inaccurate are the errors that come from human communication and the limitations of language. For example, we can be expressing a thought or a feeling inadequately, not finding the right words to express our ideas, and this can lead other people to form a mistaken impression of our opinions. So one of the best ways to see this error in action is text messaging, right? So we don't have the benefit of tone in text messages, tone of voice, or body language that we use a lot to kind of interpret human communication when we're texting or emailing or whatever. So I know that for me, one of the ways that my opinions are likely to be created an error is if I get a text message that just says K. I always kind of don't know how to feel about that, and sometimes I will assume that the person is like mad at me or irritated with me, and that will be my opinion. And sometimes I'm not correct about that at all. They were just in a rush and they just wrote K. But I often think that if someone just writes K to me, it's like a bad sign, and that can make my opinion incorrect. All right, and then the last error that commonly makes our opinions incorrect is errors in the general fashion of age. So sometimes we hold opinions that are just based on the time in which we grew up and how old we are. You've heard that old adage, like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Sometimes we get stuck in our ways of thinking. And so one example of this is that, like, our grandparents were taught to accept authority without question, whereas we are taught to question authority, right? Like, just because someone says they're a cop and that you should pull over in a dark alley doesn't necessarily mean that you should do that, right? Maybe you should call 911 and make sure that person's actually a cop. But this is different than generations previous to us that were taught to just kind of obey authority blindly. So if you grow up in a generation where you're taught to obey authority no matter what, and then you see on the news a case of a police officer shooting someone because of the color of their skin, maybe you're more likely to defend that person or defend that police officer and say, no, it wasn't because of the color of their skin, because you're just kind of naturally inclined to favor authority figures because that's, what you were taught when you were growing up. And so that could cause a person to have an error in their opinion or not. It just depends on the situation. So, John Locke says that there are three types of people that make errors: people who don't reason and just think and act as those around them. And people do this because they want to avoid difficulties that come with thinking for themselves. And then he says the second type of people that make errors are people who let passion govern their lives rather than reason. And these people tend to only listen to reason that supports their own prejudices. And then the third type of people are people who follow reason but lack sound good sense and don't look at all sides of an issue. They talk with one type of person, read one type of book, listen to one type of news program, and so they're only exposed to one type of viewpoint. Okay, so to summarize, an informed opinion is based on careful consideration of evidence, not just what we have thought for a long time, or what seems right, or what we want to be right. And when we seek out the informed opinion, we broaden our perspective, consider facts and details we may not have thought of, and decrease our chances of error. So our ability to form opinions makes us unique compared to other living things. Forming opinions is natural and unstoppable, and we can't really prevent it, so we should get good at it and learn to control our opinions rather than just allowing them to formulate on their own without much reason or logic or analysis. So the first thing we need to do is understand how opinions are formed. Like I said, we can't stop ourselves from perceiving or sensing, but when you're not in control, your brain is going to default to an uncritical thinking mode. So an uncritical thinking mode is when we perceive something, let an opinion come to mind, only focus on information that supports the opinion, and then embrace the opinion. But we want to be in a critical thinking mode. So when we're in the critical thinking mode, we're going to perceive, then we're going to investigate the issue, consider alternative opinions, and then decide which opinion is most reasonable. So the second thing we want to do here is resist the temptation to treat your opinions as fact. Once you've formed an opinion, the more you express it and think about it, the stronger it will get until you think that it actually started out as a fact. So anything you think is a fact that can be questionable and might actually be an opinion, challenge it. Don't just accept it as fact, but challenge. Where did I get this information from? Is this actually true? Do some research. And then the third thing we can do is monitor our thoughts to prevent the uncritical default mode from taking charge. So whenever you begin forming an impression of a person, place, or situation, remember the words of Epictetus. He said, "Be not swept off your feet by the vividness of the impression, but say, 'Impression, wait for me a little. Let me see what you are and what you represent. Let me try you.'" So we've talked about how opinions that are based on evidence are informed opinions, and those are really the kind of opinions that critical thinkers like to try to have and operate from. So what we need to talk about now is what exactly constitutes evidence. What is evidence? So that's what chapter 6 focuses on. And then also the idea that not all evidence is equal in terms of quality. So what makes evidence good? What are the pros and cons of each type? And which type of evidence is more reliable than other types. So an opinion is when we tell someone what we think, and evidence is when we show others that what we think makes sense. And evidence is much more interesting and impressive than just sharing your opinion, but we tend to share more opinions and little evidence. Some of the reasons for that are that, one, people have a lot of opinions to share. Two, people tend to remember their opinions but forget the process by which they arrived at them, which involves evidence, hopefully. And then three, sometimes there isn't strong enough or a lot of evidence to remember. So opinions, they take less concerted effort on our brain's part. They're just easier than coming up with evidence when you're making a point or an argument. So we may convince ourselves that we have the evidence somewhere deep in our mind, or at one time we knew it. But there's a very good chance that we only had weak evidence or none at all when we formed our opinions. So I always thought that the message of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Bible was that God punished those cities for allowing homosexuality. And I just kind of thought that that was the case because that's what I had been told by religious people, pastors, friends, family members that had said that they had read the story and they knew what it meant. So I just had that opinion, but it wasn't very well informed, and I didn't research it on my own or come up with any evidence for that being the message. I never read the passage myself in the Bible. So here I have a video clip that talks about alternative meanings for the message of Sodom and Gomorrah, and also that rendition as well, that it was God punishing the cities for homosexual acts. But it's interesting to hear a completely different side to an opinion that I thought was based on fact. The Bible says this, that is in fact what the Bible says, but many things are open to interpretation, and perhaps my opinion was very uninformed and not based on any evidence at all.
In Genesis 19, God burned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of homosexuality.
Well, that's the passage in Genesis, the 19th chapter, that everybody, even if they don't read the Bible, know about. Whether they're a part of a church or a temple, they know about Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a part of our secular wisdom, or lack of wisdom, such as the case might be.
Tonight on Greatest Heroes of the Bible, the struggle of a man against the forces of evil and of the awesome destruction wrought by an angry God against Sodom and Gomorrah.
In the 18th chapter, God says that he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because he's heard that they're exceedingly wicked.
The angels of the Lord appeared to Abraham.
And he brings with him two messengers, angels, in the form of men. The next morning, Abraham accompanies the two angels to Sodom and Gomorrah, and he takes them to Lot's house. And Lot entertains them. He feeds them. He allows them to have lodging. It was required among the Hebrew people that if someone came to your door, you were obligated to take them in. One of the most serious social breaches was to not entertain a stranger.
Sodom was an incredibly wealthy community, and they didn't want to share their wealth and thought that if travelers passed through and were welcome, well, they might want to come and take our wealth. So they canceled the law of the welcoming of travelers. And having violated the rule of Sodom, they threatened Lot and his guests with violence.
I will send no guests from my house.
The Bible says in one translation, let these men come out so we can have sex with them. And another translation says, let these men come out so that we can know them. So we're not clear as to which translation is correct. My understanding of this passage is that these men wanted to gang rape these two males, these two strangers, as an act of humiliation.
Anal rape was a great way in the ancient mind to humiliate, demean, and punish. Armies that would defeat other forces would not uncommonly rape the defeated members of his army. The Sodom story is not about license or promiscuity or even perversity. Sodom, according to the rabbis, is about cruelty. It's about inhospitality.
And so the angels strike the men with blindness and then usher the family out to safety.
It's not about homosexuality. The city was doomed to destruction before the strangers arrived at the door. There has been 500 years of reputable critical scholarship in the English language on these texts. This is not something that somebody's just come up with in the last 3 or 4 years, apologists for a, quote, liberal reading of Scripture.
I know a lot of towns that are like Sodom and Gomorrah, that you can walk into these towns and they don't show any sign of hospitality simply because you're black or simply because you're gay or lesbian or just because you're an outsider. We have many towns here in New England that are like that. That's the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And when I walk through those towns because I'm a black woman or a lesbian woman, that's when I think of Sodom and Gomorrah.
I really do think that Sodom and Gomorrah is about homosexuality. A lot of people today want to say it was really about hospitality. But if all we have is the Sodom and Gomorrah story, there's not a lot in the Old Testament that settles the question. We have to turn to the New Testament. The one that's very clear is Romans 1, the first chapter of the Epistle to the Romans.
In the first chapter of Romans, the Apostle Paul writes these words, God gave them over to shameful lusts, even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relationships with women and were inflamed with lust for one another.
It seems to me the clear meaning of that is that whatever the other stuff in the Old Testament, one thing that carries over as an enduring thing is that God disapproves of same-sex genital intimacy. He does not want men lying with men and women lying with women, denying the natural use.
When Paul uses the term natural or unnatural, he's really meaning what is customary or uncustomary. It wasn't customary for men to have sex with men in the Jewish context, but he saw it in the Greek world. And so he saw that as evidence of worshiping the wrong God, of idolatry.
His reference, of course, is to exploitive same-sex relationships among pagan Romans and Greeks. Paul certainly never contemplated the kind of monogamous, long-term relationships that are very much normal among homosexual people today.
The Bible really doesn't deal with homosexuality because it has no concept of it. There were no Greek words, no Aramaic words, no Hebrew words for these concepts of human sexuality. And therefore, the few references that have been lifted out of the Bible to be used in religious teachings to condemn homosexuality really are inappropriate.
So critical thinkers avoid the temptation of deceiving ourselves into believing that all of our opinions are well supported with evidence. Critical thinkers develop the habit of checking the quality and quantity of evidence before forming an opinion. And critical thinkers review their evidence before expressing an opinion. So to be able to successfully evaluate opinions, you need to understand the different kinds of evidence. And there are several different kinds, from personal experience to celebrity testimony to surveys and statistics. So we're going to go through them now, and we'll kind of look at the pros and cons of each. But we'll start with personal experience, which carries the most weight with us of all the different types of evidence out there. We tend to lean on it the most and feel the most confident about it. And that's because it's tangible. It's not just something we're hearing or reading about. It's something that we've seen or heard with our own eyes. And so the problem with personal experience, though, is that we tend to make exaggerations or generalizations based on just one experience. Like, let's say that you had a friend that was a Los Angeles Chargers fan, and every time they watched the game, they got really drunk and aggressive. And so you then developed the idea that all Chargers fans are drunks and looking for a fight. That would be a generalization based on just your experience with your one friend. So to evaluate personal experience to see if it is sufficient evidence, ask these questions. Are these events typical or unique? Are all Charger fans just like my friend, or is my friend unique? Are they sufficient in number and kind to support the conclusion? Do I know enough Charger fans to conclude that they are all like my friend? So no matter how well we remember an event, it's still subject to the limitations that we talked about before. The limitations of perception, the limitations of memory. And so just because we spent a significant amount of time with this one person doesn't mean that we can then take that recollection of that one person and apply it to all people, because we're human and our perceptions and our memories might not be accurate, and that also might not be true for everyone what's true of our friend. Okay, so for lecture activity 3, I'd like for you to think of a time where you were using personal experience as evidence and it may not have been sufficient evidence or good evidence. So if you can't think of a time that you were using personal experience as kind of insufficient evidence, then think of someone that you know that was doing it and give me an example in 2 to 3 sentences for lecture activity 3. So the next type of evidence that we're going to discuss is the unpublished report, which in layman's terms is basically gossip. And this is stories that we hear from other people. The problem with this type of evidence is that it's hard to confirm. We could be getting the information secondhand or 50th hand. And what happens with the game of telephone happens with gossip, and obviously affects the reliability of it. So by the time we get the information, it's been altered and changed. Words have been swapped out, the storyline, the order of the information has been switched around, the context. So all of that can make this type of evidence not reliable. So to evaluate unpublished reports to see if they have sufficient, or if they are sufficient evidence, ask these questions. Where did the story originate from? So who is the source of this information? And how can I confirm that that version is accurate? Can I go talk to the source of this information and find out if the version that I received is accurate or not. So the next type of evidence is the published report. So these would be published or broadcasted works. For example, scholarly books, professional journals, encyclopedias, magazines, newspaper articles, news broadcast radios, radio shows, or TV commentaries. But it is important that we delineate between scholarly works and non-scholarly works. So scholarly works usually have a lot of citations and are mostly fact-based, and then it's easy to check those facts because of the citations. But non-scholarly work lacks citations, and generally they have opinions kind of sprinkled in throughout. However, if the author is reliable and has done good journalism, for example, then we can usually still find support for what the author is claiming or asserting. But we need to be aware of the difference between scholarly and non-scholarly so that we can spot fact from opinion. So to evaluate published reports to see if it's sufficient evidence, ask these questions. 1, does the report cite the source of all the important items of information? 2, does the author have a reputation for careful reporting? 3, does the publisher or broadcaster have a reputation for reliability? And 4, which statements in the published report constitute evidence and which should be supported with evidence? So the next type of evidence is eyewitness testimony. And eyewitness testimony is often considered the most reliable of evidence, but we know that external and or internal conditions can interfere with the reliability of eyewitness testimony. So for example, there was a study that was done where a bunch of people were shown a car accident, a video of a car accident, and then they were separated into 5 groups, and they were asked about how fast were the cars going when they blank each other. And so then different words that got progressively more aggressive in nature were given to each one of the 5 groups, and then they were asked how fast do you think they were going when they contacted each other, hit each other, bumped each other. And as the words got more aggressive, the estimated miles per hour increased. So for example, group 1 was asked about how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other. And this group on average said about 30 miles per hour. As compared with like a little bit more aggressive, how fast were they going when they collided with each other? This group said almost 40 miles an hour. And then the group that was asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, these people reported it being over 40 miles an hour. So they all saw the exact same car accident, but their estimated miles per hour was completely different just based on the way they were asked questions about what they witnessed. And we also know that as time passes between an event and a testimony, the confusion gets greater, we start to lose some of the details of our memory, and it becomes a little bit less reliable. So to evaluate eyewitness testimony to see if it is in fact sufficient evidence, we should ask these questions. Number 1, what circumstances surrounding the event could have distorted the person's perception? Time of day, visual impairment, drugs, expectations. And 2, what circumstances since the event could have affected the eyewitness's recollection? For example, like how they were asked questions about what they saw. The next type of evidence is celebrity testimony. So celebrities not only talk about products and services, they also go on talk shows and talk about what's in the news. And because we respect them or feel connected to them on some level, we may believe that what they say is based on evidence. But it could just be their opinion. It could be that they're getting paid to say that opinion, and it could be well informed, but maybe it isn't. So to evaluate celebrity testimony to see if it's sufficient evidence, we should ask these questions. In the case of advertisements or infomercials, is the celebrity a paid spokesperson? And 2, does the celebrity offer any support, citations or sources for his or her views? So the next one is expert opinion. And expert opinion is generally more reliable than the other types of evidence that we've talked about so far. It can address the question of what is typical versus what is unique. And the problem with this evidence in terms of reliability is that there's just so much information available now. So experts are typically knowledgeable in a single narrow aspect of one discipline, and they might not consider other perspectives. And they might have a hard time staying on top of significant developments in their one area. They might think that they know the latest science or the latest information and be basing their expert opinion off that, when information is changing so quickly that maybe they're a little bit behind. So to evaluate expert opinion to see if it is sufficient evidence, ask these questions. 1, does the person have the credentials and specific expertise in the particular issue under discussion? If they support their ideas with references to current research, then that can be a pretty good indication that they do have the credentials or specific expertise. 2, was the expert paid? This will give you some insight about their motivation in forming their opinion. And then 3, do other authorities agree or disagree with the expert's view? Okay, for lecture activity 4, I would like for you to give me an example of a time when an expert opinion that you received or that someone you know received was inaccurate or incorrect or not sufficient. So you could respond to that in 2 to 3 sentences. And remember, experts can be doctors, professors, scientists, anyone who is considered to be extremely knowledgeable in their field that ended up giving you or someone you know bad information. Tell me about that. 2 to 3 sentences for lecture activity 4. All right, so then sometimes evidence comes from experimentation. There's 2 broad types of experiments, laboratory experiments and field experiments. In laboratory experiments, we can control the variables, but this creates an artificial environment. So for example, let's say that we want to know if watching violent cartoons creates aggression, then we have to control a lot of the variables. We can control like what kids are in our experiment, what cartoon it is that they're watching. We can put them into 2 groups. We can randomly assign them. We can have one group watch violent TV, one group watch Barney, and then after 30 minutes we can watch them interact with each other and see which group is more aggressive, which group has more kids punching and hitting, calling the other group names. And then if the group that watches the violent cartoons is more aggressive, then we have some basis to conclude that maybe violent cartoons increase or have some type of effect on aggression because we've controlled for so many variables. We've thought about what else can cause aggression and tried to eliminate from our studies. So maybe we thought, well, high levels of testosterone could cause aggression. So then none of the kids in our experiment were allowed to have testosterone levels over whatever number. Maybe we thought, well, sugar can cause aggression, so we made sure that the parents gave all the kids in the experiment an apple before they came, and that was all that they ate that day. We can argue that heat makes people more aggressive, so we put them in a temperature-controlled room. So we can control for all of these different types of variables in a lab experiment. However, when people are being watched, which you know that you are being watched if you're sitting in a laboratory, we tend to act a little differently. So the results that we get from these types of experiments might not be completely reliable. And then there is the field experiment, which occurs in natural settings. So this is nice opposed to the laboratory when you're not like at your home watching violent cartoons. So you might not act the same way you would if you were comfortable in your own setting. Field experiment's kind of correct for this. You are in your natural setting, but you're usually being observed. And like we mentioned before, people act unnatural when they're being observed. So this could make this type of evidence, the evidence that comes from field experiments, less reliable when people know they're being watched. So to evaluate experimentation to see if it is sufficient evidence, we should ask these questions. 1, for a laboratory experiment, has it been replicated by other researchers? Have other researchers done the same study and found the same results? If not, then that begs a bunch of questions, like, well, what did you do differently in your research than what I did? What were the variables that weren't the same? And then 2, for a field experiment, have other researchers independently confirmed the findings? So what you observed, is that the same thing that other researchers also observed? And if replication or confirmation has not yet occurred or was unsuccessful, then you really don't have sufficient evidence. So the next type of evidence is statistics, and statistics applies to any information that can be quantified or reported as a number, for example. So if we wanted to study something in psychology, we would identify, first of all, the variables that it is that we were studying and our research question. So let's say we wanted to know if studying for a test increases exam scores. So what we would need to do is find a numerical description for these variables that we can then plug into a statistical formula. So if we wanted to study if studying helps people perform better on a test, then we would have to quantify the variables of studying and the performance on the test. So we would be able to quantify those variables by turning study into study time, and that's a number, how long someone studied. And then performance on the test, we could quantify that variable by looking at exam scores, because scores are a number. And so then once we have those numbers, we're able to use them in math formulas. So statistics ultimately are summaries of complex information. They tell us information about groups of people, for example, the U.S. Census, drunk driving deaths, etc. However, they are very, very easy to manipulate. So to evaluate statistical information to see if it is sufficient evidence, we need to ask these questions. What is the source of the statistics? For example, who is reporting their statistics? What is their motivation? Why are they saying what they're saying? Because it is so easy to manipulate statistics. For example, if I said to you 100% of people that take my class say it's their favorite class ever, and then you were to ask me, like, well, how many people did you ask? And I said 2, it would be 100% if both of those people said that my class was their favorite. But that's just a manipulation of the numbers, because I kind of am implying that I asked a lot of people, or it makes it sound like I asked a lot of people, and I didn't. So we always have to look at the source, and then the second thing we need to do is find out if the source is reliable and trustworthy. One time I was watching a TV show, and I heard one of the characters on the show say that listening to Mozart while studying helps you do 50% better on the exam, or on exams. And this particular character on the show wasn't like a statistician or a scientist or a psychologist or anyone that would know that information. And in the show, they later stated that they saw it on like a meme online or something. So those sources are not always reliable. And then the third thing that we can do to evaluate statistical information is to ask, how old are the data? Maybe there are new variables that weren't accounted for when this data came out, or considered, or things we didn't know. And then finally, have any important factors changed since the data was collected? So the next type of evidence is surveys. And so this is research in which people are chosen to represent a larger population and are asked a series of questions about their behaviors, thoughts, and attitudes. So the reason that we choose people from a larger population is because we can't ask everyone in a population their thought or attitude or behavior on a certain subject. We can't ask every single person in America how they feel about Justin Bieber, because some of the people in America are in comas, or don't have phones, or don't want to participate in our research, or are 6 months old and can't speak the language yet. So since we can't ask everyone, we have to get a smaller group that represents that population, which we call a representative sample. And the representative sample needs to be randomly selected from the larger population of subjects. So if we were just going to go around and pick people out by hand rather than randomly select people to be in our sample, we might end up biasing our sample. So if I were to bring before you like 20, 50-year-old men and say, okay, this is our representative sample of America, let's see what they have to say about Justin Bieber, their attitudes and opinions are probably not representative of the attitudes and opinions of America as a whole. And so the population, just for the sake of defining it, is the entire group of people that the researcher is interested in. So surveys have to be constructed really carefully. If you've ever taken a survey before, like you apply for a job and they ask you certain questions about yourself, there are obvious desirable answers, which people that write surveys try to not have in there, because we don't want people to lie on surveys. We want them to be honest. So another thing that we want to avoid when writing surveys are what's called the double-barreled question, which is 2 questions in one, which makes it hard for the respondent to know what exactly they are answering. for example, if a question says, like, my job makes me feel happy and challenged, it's like, well, I do feel challenged, but I don't feel happy, so how do I respond to this question? Which then makes the response invalid. And even the order of the questions can affect the responses. In one study, the participants were shown a picture, and they were told, this guy in this picture, he's intelligent, kind, friendly, feisty, and blunt. And then another group was shown the same picture with the same adjectives, but just backwards. So they were told, this person is blunt, feisty, friendly, kind, and intelligent. And then they were asked what they thought of the person, or what they thought of the person based off the picture and the adjectives. And when the adjectives that were kind of nicer, the intelligent, the kind, the friendly, were given first, people said that they liked the person more in the picture. And when the nicer adjectives were given last, they said that they didn't like the person as much. I think it was like a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like this person? So even the order in which the questions are put into the survey can affect how people respond. So to evaluate surveys, we need to, 1, ask if the sample was truly representative. 2, was there random assignment? 3, were the questions clear, unambiguous, and phrased objectively? And 4, are there other surveys that corroborate this survey's findings? Okay, so there is also formal observation. If you've ever been like evaluated at work and had someone watching you as you do your job, or if you've ever been in a class and the instructor is being evaluated, these are all forms of formal observation. But there's a variety of different situations in which formal observation is done to collect information and evidence. So the 2 broad kinds of formal observation is detached observation, and this one is when the observer has no interaction with the individual that they are studying. And then there is participant observation, and this is when the researcher gets involved in the group that they're studying. They might try to kind of do the daily activities with the group, kind of immerse themselves in the group so that their own subjective experiences become part of their information, their data, their observations. So to evaluate formal observation to see if it is sufficient, we should ask these questions. 1, is it likely that the presence of the observer distorted the behavior being observed, right? Like if you're being observed at work, if you're being evaluated, you're obviously going to do your very best. But that isn't maybe your actual day-to-day behavior, and so that information that's being gathered from observing you is not 100% accurate. 2, was the observation of sufficient duration to permit the conclusions that were drawn? Were you just there observing for 5 minutes, or did you stay for a week? Because obviously, maybe as people get more comfortable with you, they forget that you're observing them, and you might see more of their actual authentic behavior. And then 3, do the conclusions overgeneralize? So if you are studying one group of people, like anthropologists will sometimes study nomadic tribes, and if you study one tribe and gather all this information, and then you try to generalize that to all tribes in this region, is that an appropriate generalization, or is it an overgeneralization? And then the last type of evidence we're going to talk about is the research review. So we do a research review when there's a ton of research in one subject that's already been done, and we kind of want to combine it. So this is sometimes called a meta-analysis, and here we are combining a bunch of findings, comparing them, and summarizing the results. So for example, we might review 1,000 different studies on neuroscience, research, and homosexuality over time, and then draw certain conclusions and summarize that information. So to evaluate a research review to see if it is sufficient evidence, we should ask the following questions. 1, do the reviewer's conclusions seem reasonable given the research covered in the review? And 2, has the reviewer omitted any relevant research? So you may have to ask another expert this if you are not an expert in that specific area. Okay, so when it comes to evaluating evidence, we have to keep in mind that we all have biases, and therefore can very rarely be totally objective when it comes to evaluating evidence. So bias is defined as tilting in one direction by our overall philosophy of life, our political or social views, our opinions on related issues, or our attitude toward the people associated with the various views. So bias may be so small that it has no effect on our evaluation of evidence, or so big that critical thinking becomes impossible. So, bias is hindering your evaluation of evidence if you commit one of these critical thinking crimes. So, you don't want to approach your evaluation wanting one side to be right. Don't begin your investigation assuming that the familiar view will prove correct. Don't look for evidence that supports the side of the issue you favor and ignore evidence that opposes it. Don't rate sources by how favorable they are to your thinking rather than by their reliability and the quality of their research. Don't be nitpickingly critical of evidence for views you oppose and uncritical of evidence for views that you favor. And when you encounter evidence that opposes your bias, don't begin arguing against it before you have even completed examining it. And the truth is, it may not be able to completely rid ourselves of bias, but we want to identify any biases and try to control them. Remember, we are searching for the truth, even if it's not what we thought or hoped. And it's important to remember that changing your mind is not dishonorable. Hanging on to a view that isn't accurate to save face, that's dishonorable and foolish and not critically thinking. So we can use the following guidelines to determine if evidence is sufficient. Evidence is sufficient when it permits judgment to be made with certainty. Certainty exists when there is no good reason for doubt. If certainty is unavailable, evidence is sufficient if one view of the issue has been shown to have the force of probability. When the view in question is demonstrably more reasonable than other views, all possible views must be identified and evaluated before one can be considered the best. And in other cases, the evidence must be considered insufficient. Withhold judgment in these cases. Restraint is an important characteristic of a critical thinker, and it is okay and acceptable to say, I don't know, if you don't have enough information to consider the evidence sufficient or not. Okay, that is it for these chapters. Don't forget to submit your lecture activities and complete all the assignments associated with this week's module, and we'll see you for the next one. Have a great day.